how do you think climate stories are placed in today's publishing environment? Are publishers welcoming of it, or uh, we had a panel discussion on this a few years ago. We just like to know if it
Yeah.
has changed. And as per our list, out of the thousands of books that comes out of English books, fiction, non-fiction that comes out of Indian publishing industry, every year we get less than 100, a very sad number. Actually,
Hmm.
not even 100, less than 70, a very sad number. So
Hmm.
we'd
I
like to know
think,
how.
yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of sort of approaches to this. Like, overall, the appetite for new fiction is very little. It's got nothing to do with climate stories or lack of climate stories. Just generally, you know, like editors, which is not to say that all the editors are like this, but a lot of the editors, especially in traditional publishing, I feel like the indie presses and the slightly more boutique publishers do take bigger risks, in fact, really don't end up taking chances on new fiction. Like, one of the more prominent features that I wanted to employ and I could employ for this anthology is because this is independently produced and distributed, is that I wanted to sort of put in print as many emerging voices as possible, right? People who don't really have a social media following. So that's also a thing in that editors, I mean, I feel like their hands are tied. I don't think they're doing it willingly necessarily, but things like social media following or a public presence before commissioning a book are conversations that do happen. And these are just the realities of the industry. I don't even know who is to really blame for that, but that's the reality of the system. So I would say that it's not necessarily about climate fiction as such. I don't even think anyone is really using the phrase climate fiction in publishing. We're using the phrase because, we're sort of tangentially connected to the topic of climate change. So that's one. Another is, yeah. So, I would say that getting a climate fiction book published would be just as difficult as getting any book published, especially when it comes to good, serious literature in India, it will just be super hard. I'm only laughing because, my book came out like a year and a half ago. And like, I'm just thinking about, yeah, it's just hard any which way you slice it, right? That being said, I do think there's quite a few presses. So, for example, Westland has instituted their own, I don't know if the word would be label, but imprint, which is just sci fi. And I'm imagining, unfortunately, I've not read it, but I'm imagining that within their sci fi imprint, there would be a lot of space for speculative, dystopic, genre fiction, as we call it. Um, yeah, but I do think that income, if I had to compare it to the West, for example, like gun to my head, I do think that we don't have enough published literature on the topic, but I don't think that's because people aren't writing. I think it's just because the stories or those books aren't getting picked up. Just like we see the same names in circulation every year, that's also because debut novels don't get picked up, right? Like really good ones. So I feel like that's a problem that's endemic to the industry. And I don't think it's particularly speaks to the state of climate fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one debut writer making it big changes, you know, uh, changes the thought process through the industry. UN, for example, his editor, UN's editor, intertitle, Sivapriya was there in one of our panels, and she said how difficult it was to present UN's book, though she believed so much in it, and how much gets, at the pitching table, how much gets sidelined. So yeah,
100%.
yeah,
Yeah, that's just the grim reality of publishing world over, not just in India.
yeah, yeah, right. So thank you for that, Alina. So I'd like to. Vijayata was not able to join us today, and her beautiful story, Calypso Housing Society, is it's something that's about what waste and waste processing can do to humans who are in proximity to it. So I'll just read out her response and my question. So our question was morphological changes that happen due to waste processing and all that is something that is not many people are aware of. And in the fictional society that she created, a lot of thought has gone into ironing out these small uh, dynamics of the society living together with the waste that is just beyond their world, and what that entire thing does to them morphologically, physiologically, and psychologically and everything. So our question to her was, how much is the story inspired by your journalistic assignments? So Vijayata is a journalist by profession, and I'm reading out a response here. The society is entirely fictional, of course, but the premise is indeed built on small journalistic work and also reading about the aftermath of industrial disasters such as Bhopal gas tragedy. A decade or so ago, I visited a massive garbage depot in a village while I was in college studying to become a journalist. The garbage accumulated over decades, and some mainly from a nearby city. That it resembled a hill from afar really shocked me. There were so many pests around, and people who worked there were not given any protective gear by the authorities. There were children playing there too. I remember visiting local municipal authorities to ask them what they were doing about this, but they seemed nonchalant. The village residents were angry and were constantly protesting, blocking garbage trucks from entering, and so on. When I spoke to them, they kept asking me how I could feel if somebody came and dumped garbage in my house. This really stayed with me, especially their anger and the authorities' lack of care. But to build a sustainable garbage disposal system, I have tried to translate this frustration into a short story. And our next question was an obvious one, how she silences the journalistic voice when it comes to fiction. So, is there any difficulty she faces in silencing that reporter's voice? Her response was, when I write fiction, I am no longer a journalist. It is, of course, easier said than done because the journalistic voice is a sharp, critical, and unforgiving one. It is a work in process to turn down the volume of that voice. In reporting, every detail is essential, but in fiction, it is not required to give so much detail unless it is taking the story forward. A lot of it is left to the reader to imagine and play with. What has also helped me grow as a writer is developing the voice of the main character I am writing about. I visualize what they look like, what they wear, how they speak, etc., to really work my imagination to build the story. There is also much space to play around with genres like speculative fiction. There is a dream sequence in a short story I'm currently writing and completely defies logic. In journalistic writing, I would never be able to play with words in such a way. So Vijayata had some interesting answers. So thank you, Alina, for coordinating that.